This time on Goss's Garage, I want to tell you a little bit about rattling noises underneath the car. See, there are all sorts of parts under a car that lead to noises and so on. And one of the most common is bushings. Now, there are all these rubber bushings underneath a car. And a rubber bushing is simply where they put a metal sleeve inside the part, and then they have a rubber piece inside of that and a second sleeve for a bolt to go through. So here we have metal sleeve, we have rubber, then we have another sleeve, and a bolt would go through the center of that. Well, the rubber over time deteriorates, and when it does, the metal starts rattling against the other pieces of metal. So one of the things when you have a rattle underneath the car, you want to make sure that you go under the car and look at all of the bushings, and there are tons of them. There are bushings in the front suspension, in the rear suspension. There are bushings in the cradle where it's mounted to the car, and it goes on and on. So make sure that you check all of those. Now here we have a good example. This is a trailing arm bushing out of a Honda CR-V. This is a new one right here. And we can look at the metal or the rubber in there, and the rubber's in good shape. And what this does is this allows an isolation point for the rear suspension so that as you go over bumps and so on, all of these pieces in here, there's an arm that goes around this big part that can move up and down, it can slightly move back and forth on the rubber inside it. Well, these have a nasty habit of deteriorating, like this one here, and when they do, the rubber actually breaks. It stays in place, so you have to look at it kind of carefully. You're looking for major cracks in the rubber, but the metal bar in the center of this thing will hammer itself against the sides of this outer sleeve. And that, of course, makes thumping and bumping noises under the back of the car. And this type of bushing is used on a lot of cars, so make sure that you look for cracks in that rubber webbing inside that bushing. Now, other problems that we see that lead to noises and so on, here we have, this is a control arm off of a GM vehicle, and mounted into the end of it is a ball joint. Now, a ball joint is simply a joint, it's a ball and socket that allows movement in more than one direction at the same time. So if you think about this business with the ball joint here, out here is going to be the wheel. And you have to steer the wheel, so this part right here has to turn like this. Well, if you hit a bump while that's turned, the wheel is going to move up and down, so this has to be able to move in this manner as well. So it can turn, it can go in just about any direction at the same time. So over here we have one that we've cut apart. You can see the inside of it. There's a plastic sleeve in there, and there's the ball. It's a ball and socket. Here we can flip it over and we can see the ball more plainly. What happens is that plastic in there wears over time, and when it does, this centerpiece can move up and down. It rattles. Well, when it rattles, every time the wheel goes up and down on these little tiny bumps, these things rattle like crazy. So always check the ball joints to make sure that the free play in them is within manufacturer's specifications. Some of them allow quite a bit, others allow almost no free play. As a matter of fact, some of them, they have to be so tight that in order to measure free play, you have to use a micrometer. They're that precise. Now, another thing that we see that creates noise under the vehicle, here we have, this is a link. This is from a GM truck. This is a link for the sway bar. Sway bar goes from one side of the vehicle to the other. Then these links connect the sway bar, the ends of the sway bar, down to the lower control arms, such as we have here. Well, again, these are a ball and socket, and in this case, this upper one, it wore. And I mean it seriously wore out. And that meant that every time you hit the teeniest little bump, this ball would rattle in the socket, and you'd have this horrible rattling sound underneath the car. And one other thing, if you happen to have a GM truck that uses a sway bar link that looks like this, make absolutely sure that the new one has these washers on it. See, some come without the washers, and you have to remove them from the old link and put it onto the new link in the proper position, because if you don't, this part will pull through the piece that it attaches to too far, and it will hit other parts of the car because it sticks out too far on the other side. So a good one will have these washers on it. The cheaper ones don't. All right, again, this is another type of sway bar link. We can see here that the ball and socket on the end of this is just, there's nothing left. It just flops all over the place. Horrific noises coming from those things. Now, this next one is one that will throw you. Shock absorbers. Now, of course, the bushings can go bad on the bottom or up here on the top, and when they do, they're going to rattle, and that's going to be an obvious thing. You can look at it and you can see that the bushings are worn and bad. They may not even be there. But what you cannot see is the inside of this. Now, you look at this shock absorber, and you can see that there are a number of different parts inside it. These are valves and seals and so on. And over time, these may wear. And when they do, what happens is that they'll rattle against one another. So you go over these really gentle bumps, and you get this constant rattling under the car. Well, don't forget to check the shock absorbers, because it may be inside the shock absorber where it's causing the noise. So these are all things that, well, they can drive you nuts if you don't take the time to check them out and find out where the problem is. Plus, some of these things, like the ball joints, for instance, they can be incredibly dangerous, because if they wear to the point where they're making noise, or some of these suspension bushings, when they're making noise, they are dangerous because the wheel could separate from the car. And I guarantee you, that'll ruin your day. And if you have a question or a comment, how about dropping me a line at radio@goss-garage.com.